This is Empowering Homeschool Conversations.
We want families to come here and gain insightful strategies that empower them to successfully teach diverse learners at home.
Hosted by founder and CEO of SPED Homeschool, Peggy Ployer.
Our goal is that these powerful weekly conversations will boost your confidence to cultivate the best at-home learning environment for your student.
For more homeschool resources, go to spedhomeschool.com. You're listening to Empowering Homeschool Conversations with Peggy Ployer.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Empowering Homeschool Conversations. So today we're going to hear from a homeschool veteran, Lisa Walls, about the wisdom she gained while teaching her sons and addressing the needs of her youngest one, who is on the spectrum at home, and how she is now using that wisdom in her advocacy work. So my name is Leilani Melendez, and I'm your guest host today for this episode while Peggy is away on vacation. So welcome, Lisa.
Hi, thanks for having me. Doing well.
So you're basically here to share your story because your son has grown up, you have homeschooled him, and you have a lot of encouraging words to share with other parents that are on this journey.
Well, yes. And you mentioned homeschooling wisdom that I've learned, and I just want to be really clear. I learned it because it came from other moms, other advocates, other teachers, other paraprofessionals who spoke wisdom into my life and what I was doing. And I can look back on the 20 years that we spent on this journey with my struggling learner to figure out what worked, what didn't, what was hugely valuable, what was really kind of toss away stuff. So if I've acquired any wisdom at all, it really originally came from somebody else.
So that's why we're here.
Yeah, I can see that. You know, the valuable thing about sharing our perspectives and our stories is just in and of themselves, they're hugely instructive. But even the nuance of what takes place in each homeschooler's journey is instructive too in various ways. If nothing else, when you resonate with somebody's story and you walk away from that, remembering a little bit of their journey, you can then extrapolate even more into your own life, because we have layers of complexity in each of our journeys, but sometimes those layers mesh, and we mesh with people we're learning from or who are mentoring us on multiple levels. And we don't discover that until we reach that next level ourselves, that somebody who's spoken to our life 20 years ago is still, you know, their journey, their experience, their stories are still speaking to us.
Yeah. Okay. So tell us about your son.
Okay. Well, I have two sons, but my first son was not a struggling learner by any stretch. Everything came easy to him. He was gifted. And I thought I had it made in the shade as a mom. I really did. I really thought I could just secondarily pass off education to, as long as they're in good schools, they're fine. And then my second son came along, and it was very clear very quickly when he started showing traits of being on the spectrum. He probably wasn't even 6 months old. So I had some insight because I was diagnosed with Asperger's when I was 19. And through that process, and then learning what I needed to learn in order to develop coping mechanisms and adjusting to the environments that I was in, I had to come up with some ways to cope. So I had learned some things along the way, and I was pretty high functioning, had lots of masks, which of course wasn't a term we even used back then, but of course is now extremely relevant. And I thought I was going to be okay. So when my son started showing signs, I wasn't alarmed. What I was alarmed at is the other areas of learning that he seemed to struggle in, because he did have a severe language delay. And that takes everything that you think of on the table for just doing some interventions with an autistic learner as they're going through school, or as they're learning how to adjust to a classroom or a teacher, or dynamics with other students. It takes everything that happens in that sphere and adds a whole new sphere 10 times the size when you have a struggling learner. on top of somebody who has the traits of autism, whether it's, some communication hiccups or the socialization struggles. That's already hard enough to help kids navigate through. But when you've got language delays on top of sensory integration, on top of, in his case, he's also dyslexic, which is not terribly uncommon, to have other language issues coming into the scene because of the sensory integration. So, he actually, we spent some time counseling, and he ended up under the tutelage of a director from a school specifically for dyslexia. And we did that in the middle of our homeschool journey. And she said that, easily half of her students who were dyslexic were either autistic, ADHD, or somewhere on the spectrum, and also dealing with other behavior issues. So you have, for a lot of these kids, and now the new stats have just come out with the CDC correlating all this research as recently as 2020, and almost 1 in 3 people who are diagnosed with autism have an intellectual disability of some sort. So it is not unusual, but it does add layers of complexity to their school experience, which in his case was disastrous, to say the least. He was failed on every level by well-meaning, extremely capable teachers and paraprofessionals and people who were providing therapies. But the system itself, he was one of those who was absolutely going to get caught in the cracks. So it was a hard decision to pull him out, because I was a previous classroom teacher. I knew when teachers were really trying hard. I knew when an administration was being supportive. And I can identify that in both schools he was in, grade school, and we were in 2 different grade schools at one point, that was the case. We had a supportive administration and teachers who were not naive or dismissive, or they were really doing whatever they could to be attentive, but just the reality of being in a classroom, sharing that teacher's attention with 25, 30 other kids. And he wasn't even in an overcrowded classroom. And he was one of the few with an IEP. So he was like in the best case scenario, and he was still being failed. He failed first grade, and they remediated him. They called it the gift of time. They said, because of course I was just brokenhearted when I realized that he had not, we had actually sent him through kindergarten twice. And because he'd started early enough to where we thought he just needed another year, and we sent him through kindergarten twice. So when they told us at the end of first grade that he was not going to get progressed, we were just broken. He was already a big kid, and he was already twice the size. 95th percentile for height, 98th percentile for weight. He had shoulders this wide, and there are these little guys who were in the classroom, and they would look up at him at the beginning of the year and they think, is he a third grader? And they were scared of him. He had trouble making friends, which is the worst case scenario for somebody on the spectrum, because you already have your own internal challenges. You don't need help having challenges. So none of the other kids would approach him. He had to really go out of his way to work to make a friend. And break through multiple layers of barriers there. So when they were going to hold him back, of course, we had to accept it if he was going to stay in public school. But we were just broken over it, because we knew he was already struggling in so many areas, and now we were going to make it socially miserable for him. And the thing about being on the spectrum is, a lot of times when you're in that world, and I can relate from my childhood when I had zero coping mechanisms and zero self-interventions, I can remember just being completely oblivious to so much of what was going around me. And it wasn't until there had been a parent-teacher meeting, and my parents were brought into the school to discuss where I was struggling, that I was even aware there was a problem, because I was getting A's on my schoolwork. And as far as I knew, my world was fine. And it wasn't until teachers started saying things to my parents like, she's really coming across as socially behind, or Behaviorally, there are some things that concern us about her maturing and, the level she's reaching there. And it wasn't until somebody brought it to my parents' attention I was even aware that things were amiss. Because in my world, it was normal to not have friends because I didn't necessarily even want them so much. I knew for a large part of what my son was going through, he was not going to be, it was not going to be a pain point for him. He was largely going to be in his world, which he was. And he was very happy in his world. And his world was, I know a lot of parents and teachers of boys who are obsessed with, superheroes are going to relate, but his world was Spider-Man and Legos. And he was, as long as he had his Lego Spider-Man with him and that guy was in his pocket, the boy was fine. He was emotionally settled. There weren't a lot of meltdowns for him. When they happened, they were for real. And strangers would get involved and store management would get involved if we were at a public place. So the meltdowns happened, but they were not as frequent because he's just a very low key kind of guy, and he always has been. So that wasn't happening a lot in the school. So there wasn't a lot of disruption. He wasn't aware of a lot of what was going on. But we, the teachers, we as his parents, we were extremely aware of what it meant to take a child who had gone through kindergarten twice, hold him back again in first grade, and then also find that he's still challenged enough to where he's not at reading level after repeating essentially 2 years. And then he got to third grade. And by then, of course, his IEPs had come back. Everybody's trying. And of course, he was involved in applications for federal grants for certain sound equipment that would have helped him through his auditory issues. Never arrived, by the way. 2 years in the waiting in public school for special sound equipment for him. He was supposed to get speakers, and there was supposed to be a microphone the teacher would wear so that it would kind of generate more directly to him, and he would not miss so much of the teaching experience, the auditory learning experience. 2 years, the stuff never showed up. So now, granted, this was a good 15, 16 years ago. Things, I hope, are better now. However, even if he had gotten that equipment, it was probably too little too late. And at the end of third grade, they talked to me about retaining him another time. And I was done. There's no way you're going to take my 5'4", 150-pound child and call him a third grader again. The kids are scared of him. He doesn't have friends. Whenever he tries to make friends, they back away. Whenever he tries to do anything physically with them in PE or on the playground at recess, they're scared. Anyway, it was just layering challenge on top of challenge on top of challenge. And now, of course, there are nuances once you progress in grade school to socialization, where it's not just a matter of playing alongside the other kids and being considered friendly and approachable. Now you're expected to engage with the other kids conversationally, and that wasn't happening. He was a delayed language user. He didn't start talking until he was almost 3. And I truly believe the only reason why he was is because he was engaged in a Montessori at the time. And the Montessori method was employed very well there. And in that it was a preschool environment, obviously, at that age. And he had manipulatives, and he had tasks that were exploratory. And it was not a classroom situation. It was not a children line up other than, in a group. They just kind of collaborated all day long as kids, and they interacted all day long as kids. And that's part of the method. I was Montessori'd. And so that's one of the reasons I was such a big advocate of it for my children. And so he did actually adopt language for the first time just at about 3 years old. And he started using it enough to where he could ask for what he wanted. He could get his needs across. But it wasn't until about 6, 7, 8 where you could really understood what he said. So during those formative years, when he's in kindergarten for 2 years, first grade for 2 years, any intellectual disability that he had, which it was mainly reading language related, or any neurodivergence he was exhibiting, it was just being augmented between the inability to socialize because he was so much older and bigger, and then the inability to socialize because he didn't have the language, or the conversation, or the knack for, or the desire to even go up to a child and face them and engage with them. Now, if the kid wasn't interested in Lego men, he had, that was, my son was like, I made a friend today. And of course, you find out that kid is very also interested in Legos and Lego men. So they had a little conversation about it. And for him, that was making a friend, because that was the closest he ever got to making a friend in school. So without the benefit of these excellent school systems that he was in, these A+ school systems, the teachers, were, as skilled as they were, weren't benefiting him. The administration, as effective as they tried to be, wasn't benefiting him. The reality is he was just a candidate for all the ways the schools can fail you. And I don't regret any of it. Obviously, I felt like as a parent, my job was to be supportive of any intervention that could potentially help. And that means taking risks. If remediating them for a year is the decision, the consensus, it's a risk that, yes, you're going to pay a price. Your child's going to struggle in social development areas or with self-esteem, which of course that became an issue too. By the time he had finished his first year of third grade and they had told him he was going to have to do a second one, he had already lost the love of learning. He had absolutely didn't want anything to do with school. It was painful. It was just everything that he equated with the school experience was painful. And I just kept reflecting as a former teacher who was a working single parent by then, and worked about 50 hours a week. I was just reflecting, could I do it worse? Could I screw it up and make it worse than what it is now? Maybe, but the likelihood was decreasing by the day. The likelihood of me not dedicating enough time and energy to a homeschool environment, because at this point it's becoming our only option, because a private school at this stage wouldn't accept him. He was at a pre-K reading level at 10 years old. There's no private school that can accommodate that unless they're a special needs school. And in our area, we didn't have it at the time. So homeschooling was the only option. And here I am looking at my schedule, a single mom working 50, 60 hours a week in the family business. The family is counting on me, so I can't slack there. I can't take time off. I can't take a hiatus. Can I even do this to any level, much less a level that is going to help a child who has just completely had a disastrous experience? Can we ever recover? And I thought the only way we're going to recover is if I do this. If I give it 5 hours a week, and he's 10 at this time. So there is a little expectation that he can be a little autonomous. And again, I was Montessori, so I did have high expectations on that regard. So, as long as I can spend 5 hours a week, he can spend 10 to 15 hours a week where he can focus, which for people on the spectrum, focus is not your challenge. Focus is the challenge you don't have. If you're interested in something, it's gonna be a focus. If somebody has a Lego man in his pocket and he can bring it out and stare at it for 15 minutes and do this, just that motion right there for 15 minutes, steady, and that's all he does for 15 minutes. Focus is like your superpower. So I knew we'd be able to develop some of that as long as he was interested in the material. The challenge I had was I had no resources. I had another child who also was starting to struggle in school for other reasons, just getting lost in the cracks, right? And he was starting to have test anxiety, and he was starting to show some anxiety issues. And I had a job that was all consuming. So my job was to just accept that it's not going to look perfect. It's not going to be ideal. I'm not going to be able to teach so much as I'm just going to be used to direct and coach. So I'm not going to get, a lot of time with them one-to-one, but it's going to be enough to maybe definitely do better than what we were experiencing and maybe recover some of what he lost. So anyway, that is a long foundation to just share the upshot. The upshot is we homeschooled for 2 months, and it was crazy disaster because, of course, I'm trying to replicate traditional schooling because that's my mindset, or Montessori experience, and we have no manipulatives and they're already beyond the age of really needing them. So I had a terrible homeschool experience for 2.5 months. I went to reset and just say, and this was before there was online resources. This was before Facebook. This was before, well, it's like the advent of all of that, right? The very beginnings of all of that. So I didn't know that there was such a thing as deschooling. But I looked at the situation after 2 months and went, oh my gosh, we got to do something. This is not working. Let's reset. I've got 10 months to teach material that I know if I had at least an hour one-on-one with them a day, because I ended up doing both boys, an hour one-on-one with them a day, we could probably get this material done in 3 or 4, because I knew how much time was wasted in the classroom with classroom management, with administrative paperwork, with just administrative tasking, with things that we could just cut through and get it done. So I kind of made the decision knowing that I could take the pressure off myself and step back. So we ended up deschooling without even realizing that was a thing or it's important. We ended up deschooling for about 4 or 5 months. And in the spring, I said to the boys, okay, it's time to get back on track. We got about 4 months to learn a year's worth of material, but I think you can do it. And they kind of looked at me like I was half nuts. I mean, they had spent the deschooling time reading, watching movies. We had just, had discussions. We worked on literacy because obviously my younger son struggled with that. He was at a pre-K reading level at 10 years old. So we just working on some fundamentals, and my other son also needed some deschooling time with his anxiety. And he had also lost the love of learning. It was just about undoing all of that and unraveling it, letting it rest, and then reworking to a new design. And the new design was simply checking in on them for 30 minutes a night after, giving them some basic tasks. This was the very beginning of Time for Learning. It was the brand new thing. They only had a few modules back then, but we did the math and we did the science. And of course, I was setting some reading language assignments for them based on the books and movies that they loved. So it was very unit driven. So it was very simple for me to plan out, and checked in with them 30 minutes a night and gave them about an hour or 2 on the weekend where we just went through and I sought opportunities to find out what they wanted to learn about. And then we discussed what that would look like. And then I started developing lessons for the next unit. And in the first couple months, of course, we didn't do anything. But he started taking some online diagnostic and reading assessments in that spring before we even started, just through the 2 months of a disastrous homeschool experience and 5 months of deschooling. He had increased a grade level in reading just from being given books and audiobooks, just being handed that. No instruction, no intervention, no help, nothing, just some books and audiobooks. He advanced from pre-K to end of kindergarten learning. By the time we had done our 4 months of schooling, because we finished at the end of June, he went from the end of kindergarten, where he tested early in the spring, to end of 4th grade. So he was at level, even a little bit above level, for a kid who had been 10 years old and tested pre-K for his reading. It was astonishing. And I can tell you, I did not do all that much. What I did was I released them from the parts of school that they found were not a fit for their learning style, for their energy level, for their personality. I didn't strap them to a desk. I just said, go. I said, go when you want to. sleep until you're finished sleeping and go. And just releasing that increased, both of them performed much better at the end of the year test than I ever expected. But I did not expect him to advance 4 years of reading levels after just 4 or 5 months of, again, unit studies based on the novels they loved, based on the stories they loved, based on the movies they loved. So of course we hit it all. We were Star Wars people, and we were, obviously superhero people. We were Harry Potter people. And the biggest goal I had was just to undo the damage. And the biggest challenge with that was for them to regain their love of learning. And when they were confronted with the opportunity to direct their own learning, they did not sit and waste it. And this is the story that I think it really resonates with me, that I've heard from all these other parents, all these years, 20 plus years in this environment, is the kids step up. They step up when they're ready. I mean, some of them, they have to deschool. They have to get to a level where they're feeling a little comfort level with the activity they're doing or the curriculum they're doing. I get that. There's sometimes a little up ramp in until that moment. But when they get it, when they're engaged powerfully. And you would have to stop them. You would have to actually step in front of them and say, stop working. We've got to move on to something else, or we're taking a break, or we're taking a week off. They want to go. They want to keep going. And look, my kids are not and I've heard this from so many other parents, my kids are not poster children for hardworking, perfect integrity, adult-like character kids. They're normal kids. They loved video games. They loved sitting around on Saturday morning and just watching TV and, oh, Mom, every time I turned it off. So they were those kind of kids. They were just completely, obviously we did go to church, and we had other things in our lives that expanded into the faith arena. But from the outside looking in, they were like any other kids of this world. They were video game kids. They loved movies. They loved television. They wanted to do the dish, or they were willing to do the dishes. But nobody really wanted to do the dishes. They would step up when asked, but they would have to be asked. They were very normal that way. And they, sometimes the dishes weren't perfectly clean. Sometimes they balked a little bit when being asked to step in and help coordinate it. Because, of course, the homeschool experience we had was, I'm working so much. If you guys are going to learn at home, you also have to help at home. It's just the way it has to be. There's too much going on for you to just sit and receive. You've got to actually step up and give. And, then again, in the Montessori framework is making help and work accessible for kids so that they have successes and that they're doing it well, and that they know how to eventually do things to a degree of real polish and performance, so they can actually look back at the work they've done and be extremely proud of it. So if the dishes weren't done perfectly, nobody got upset, but there was a moment to go back in the kitchen and say, all right, see this, I found this, and that's okay. It happens. It is something you have to watch for, though. And then rewashing the dish and show them how to, sometimes, yes, you have to get out the scraper, and this is but it's got to be where they can reach it. You can't expect that to reach adult level performance in some of these tasks and chores, and then not actually give them access to what they need to do it with. So it was a refresher for me on the Montessori front of that philosophy, but it was one of those experiences where you almost couldn't fail, because the student-led learning environment is powerful to engage that student internally and give them drive. So they had more drive to succeed than any teacher had ever had for them to succeed. Not that they didn't have wonderful, dedicated teachers, but their teachers were not them. Their teachers were not personally involved in this experience. When you're personally involved in an experience, there's no telling what you can do once you're engaged and powerfully want to achieve something. And they did. They wanted to, my older son, who had been a gifted learner early on and was showing signs of just anxiety kind of pulling him down, He wanted to be considered bright again. He wanted to be, regarded as somebody who was extremely capable academically. And he wanted to be knowledgeable. He saw that as part of the identity of who he was. So he still, to this day, he's almost 30 years old, and he reads voraciously. I don't know anybody, even my husband, who's an extremely well-read intellectual guy. I don't know anybody who reads as much as he does. He's a continual seeker of knowledge. And my younger son, because of his issues with the audiological issues that come with sensory integration disorder, he found that audiobooks were his key to knowledge. And he is one of the most astute, in terms of civic affairs, astute people I know of his age, because he listens to podcasts all day long. He is a knowledge seeker, and that's where he lives. But it had to be driven based on personal interest, and it couldn't be my personal homeschool that I was designing to succeed, because we missed. When that happened in those early months, that was a miss. I couldn't design it, be a fanatic about the minutia of it or the planning of it. I had to give them room to breathe and grow and lead the learning. Once I did that, and I've heard this said before in some communities when it comes to deschooling is as much for the parents as it is for the kids. Deschooling is as much about spending 4, 5, 6 months, maybe even a year, in reestablishing the framework of who you are as a parent and what your expectations are for yourself, and then who you are as an instructor or director of your children's instruction, and your expectations of yourself there, and then figuring out what that looks like in real life, how that's going to manifest in the day-to-day, how that's going to lead how you direct them in other ways, right down to where you plan to take a vacation as a family. Now, all of a sudden, now you're not thinking as a parent, I just want time off and have fun with my kids. You're thinking, I want to have time off, have fun with my kids, and where can we go where they're going to learn something brilliant that will impassion them for the next year. And so it feeds every part of you. So dropping that pure parent hat and putting on that parent and homeschooler hat, sometimes it takes months for us just to identify, especially when our kids have been in public school, to identify who we are. Because when your kids have been in public school, you are your child's tutor from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. You are helping them through homework, and you are helping them navigate their take-home assignments and their backpacks, and making sure everything is in control and you're on top of things as a parent. Did you get the notice about the play next month? Because your child has a role and you're going to have to be able to be at rehearsals. Or did you get the notification about the pajama day? And do you have something ready for them? Or all your kids' pajamas shabby with holes in them, and now as a parent you have to run out to Target at 10 o'clock at night and grab a new set of pajamas so they're not embarrassed on pajama day. So that's your role when your kids are enrolled in that environment. It's a support background role. You're still active, but then when you have to switch over to the homeschooling role, now you're no longer being led by a teacher sending notes home, and that's what you're supposed to do. You are the teacher sending notes home, and you're giving yourself notes that this Saturday might be a good idea for a trip to the zoo, because we just read an amazing book about giraffes, and they're just not getting the difference between giraffes and other animals in the powerful way they could. So I think we need a zoo trip so they can see one in real life, because until you do, you really don't understand the whole concept of what a giraffe is. So you get these amazing opportunities to reinvent yourself as a parent and a homeschooler. So deschooling, I've heard it said a million times, and it's so true, is just as much for the parent homeschooler as it is for the kids. But that was a very, very important part of our journey, was to undo, in our case, actual damage that was caused. Not by anyone in particular, and not even by the institution, just by the way they were exactly the kind of kids who fell through the cracks, and so many do. So we were just blessed that we could kind of navigate through that and around that without a lot of assistance and help. Because back then there wasn't a lot. You could join a co-op if you were near one. I was part of some online forums and groups for some other nonprofit activity I was involved with. And there were a lot of homeschoolers in that environment. And most of them were not involved in co-ops just simply because they didn't live near one. And there was just not an option for that. So when my boys said, well, I'm not really interested in a co-op, I really don't think, I'm like, hey, you know what? Lots of parents homeschool without one. Let's try it. Worst case scenario is you just get your group activity in church, and that's where you focus getting your group activity. And that's exactly what happened for us. But it was the kind of experience that laid a foundation for me. Now, here I am years after they've graduated, and I'm still looking for parents' stories because I feel like, yes, there's more information, there's more accessibility to the information, there's more community for homeschoolers, and that's absolutely needed. But there's a lot of information that works in a practical sense in our real life world. And it either contradicts or seems to, or is not represented in the research that's out there, or there's great research that's out there. And it's hard as a homeschool parent, especially when you're really super busy, to identify the research that you should be looking at, applying, how to apply it, and whether or not it's good research. How do you identify that it's even relevant, or is it just fake news at this point? Because there's a lot of that. It's not just for mass media anymore. Fake news is everywhere. So how do you discern what the good research is, where the important breakthroughs are happening? And how do you know as a parent what to apply or what new research to even look for? How do we search for this stuff? So I do still see a need for parents to get involved. And even if it's on a level of just supporting your local homeschool families who you know, with just whatever you can share. There is a reality that there's a lot that has changed. Like, for example, when I had my son's IEP for the first time, we were going over the IEP, the only diagnosis that he could have was a behavior disorder, because his learning disability, his language delays, his autism, all these things that had been diagnosed issues that we paid thousands for a private neuropsychologist to diagnose accurately, because we wanted some accurate reports. All of his issues, none of them were represented in the IEP. They had to make up scenarios in his eye, because they knew he needed social help, but they knew he needed behavioral help, but there was no box they could check. So now, of course, the IEPs are a little bit better. They're a little bit more on target. There are diagnoses included in there that are more relevant to people on the spectrum. But back then we had to basically charge that he was aggressive. His behavior was aggressive. It wasn't really, certainly. I mean, unless you took his Lego man. If you took his Lego man, his behavior might get aggressive. But we had to kind of make that up. The teachers kind of had to go, I guess we'll just check that box just to get him something. So now things are certainly better and they're changing for the good. But here's the rub. We have more people being diagnosed on the spectrum. Just in 2010, it was 1 in 80 something. Now it's 1 in 36. And the stats are just staggering. 400% increase in diagnosis over the last 20 years. 4 times the amount of kids are being diagnosed now than were just 20 years ago when mine were. So we have 4 times the kids being diagnosed since the day when mine were. And since the 70s, when this was 60s and 70s is when this was really starting to take off as an area of interest for sociologists and psychologists and pedagogical studies. So back in the 60s and 70s with the earliest research, we have something like 40 times the number of kids being diagnosed now that were being diagnosed back then. Then it was like 1 in 1,600 or something, and now it's 1 in 36. It's staggering, the change that has made. And there's been an increase in the data recently in the amount of minority students being diagnosed. Now, that could absolutely been because they were an underserved community for so long in terms of diagnosis and interventions and in getting the testing. That's very likely. But the fact is that means there's more being diagnosed there than expected. And now we have more increases in those communities as well. So what are you to do if you are on the spectrum and you have a disability and you're a challenged student and you're a minority potentially not receiving the services or the proper services because the person who's supposed to advocate you to the system, maybe English is their second language. How is a parent whose English is their second language going to be the most effective advocate when they struggle to identify the terminology that's being used? You know, parents, English-speaking parents have a hard time with it. So there are lots of underserved groups, and there are lots of groups that I think are crying out for a better understanding and a better sense of the research that could potentially help their child and help their child's teacher. And if you're a homeschooler, you're all about the research because it's up to you. If there's anybody who's going to get better at understanding this, it better be you as the homeschooling parent.
So I have, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question. Going back to your son, I wanted to ask you the transition between schooling and then, getting a job and becoming independent. Like what did that transition look like? Was there a transition? How long did it take? Because how old is he now?
My autistic learner is 27.
Okay. Yeah, I knew he was almost 30. So I'm just kind of curious what that looks like. Because I know a lot of parents are wondering, like, okay, how do I know that I was successful or what? Like, almost like they don't know what's going to happen, but they're still concerned. Does that make sense?
It does. And that's a really important question. And that is certainly the question I had in my brain from the time that my youngest was about 13 to 17. It was the prevailing thought of the day is, what's going to happen in 5 years? Is he going to be working? Is he going to be in college? What's going to happen? And there was no way to predict that. The challenge of the spectrum thing is that it's very hard to hear what's going on with other kids and families and adopt that into your own environment or adopt that as, oh, that's a path we can follow. Because chances are your ASD kid is somewhere different on the spectrum than the other ASD kid. So you could be very close with a parent who's also dealing with a spectrum kid at the same age, and they could have completely different paths because their spectrum disorder affects their life differently. For example, because my son was language delayed and language has always been an issue, there is no way that he could really get a job in customer service. And, for a lot of us, that's how we put ourselves through college, or customer service jobs or sales jobs. And if you gave him a script, he could sell. And he's done that before. He just doesn't like it because he has to step in front of people all day. And that's exhausting for him to be in front of people all day. But he could do it. But what he wouldn't be able to do is be on the phone with somebody with an audiological issue, with sensory integration issues in an environment like a typical office environment, and talk on the phone to somebody and try to get their needs met. He would misidentify a lot of what they said. So the language delay in autism does sometimes have effects down the road that will translate to identifying ideal jobs for them. His ideal, get you through college job is actually kind of like a manual labor job, which is not uncommon. And so this is like the first time him being, like a huge kid has really worked in his favor because he can haul and lift and do all that kind of stuff. And he loves anything where he's assigned a role to take care of a space or spatial experience. So like organizing shelving, so any retail establishment that, so what I'm trying to say is every situation is going to be unique. That is not going to be everybody's situation. There are plenty of people on the spectrum who have perfectly appropriate verbal skills for any job they want, but they still have issues to deal with related to sensory integration and stuff like that in the office place or in the workplace that do affect them. And that's the research that I'm passionate about right now and that we're launching into on our end, is helping people who want to launch into a career, but they're struggling because of something in their autism experience is creating a barrier for them in their chosen profession.
So it's almost like the homeschool parent has to be very in tune with their child as they're growing up to see what their strengths are. So that as they move into adulthood, they can kind of help guide them into whatever career path or what would help them become more independent.
Yeah, I would say for an ASD child, strengths are not as important as interests, because there are a lot of strengths that people have that are skills that they end up building. And when you're on the spectrum, a lot of your lack of skill is just simply because you haven't tried it before, because you've been in your own little universe and you're kind of happy where you're at. So people haven't pushed you out of your comfort zone and you haven't tried something new. But once you try that new thing and you get a little sophisticated at being able to do it, it becomes a skill. And then you end up probably doing it well enough to have a job in that area. But you're not going to get there unless there's an innate interest in that job or that career path. And if your child is extremely musical, they may not ever want to get on a stage and be a performer, but there are lots of jobs in the industry that can keep them fed and help them provide for a family in the future if they want to be in that industry. But if they're interested and passionate about music and that's their obsession, they should try to get a job in the industry. It doesn't have to be as a performer, which is what everybody knows or thinks of when they think of musician, but there are all kinds of industry related jobs out there. So that you're right. You have to be in tune with what your kiddo can not only do fair, like obviously I wouldn't want my dyslexic language delayed learner to ever be a scribe, right? He'll write things backwards. So you don't want to set them up for failure, put them in things which are obviously the wrong category for them. But that doesn't mean they can't take their interest and develop a skill set in an area that's just new to them and then become really, really good at that. But it has to be an interest first. So interest first, skill later. And these skills can be developed in early adulthood, 15, 16, 17. There's, and most homeschooling families who have their kids at that level, they're like ready to graduate, they realize that most of what they learned at the high school level, they actually learned in the last 2 years. They were kind of maybe flaky or not real mature about the way they were approaching things back at 13, 14, 15, but now they're focused and they're ready to go. And this is a huge opportunity for parents who have kids who are about to graduate and they have no idea where they're going to be. Well, have those conversations, because it's not too late to jump in on what they're passionate about, because it may have taken them this long to figure that out. But they're already 17. So they're graduating next year. So there's really nothing we can do. He's going to have to work, at Walmart. No. He can pick up a passion at 18, develop some skills and break into that business at 19 or 20 and apprentice and learn on the job. It's never too late for your kid to take an interest and develop a skill. And a lot of us are finding too, we need to be patient and not call their 18th birthday their date of graduation. For my boys, they studied for the GED because they wanted to finish early. And then they realized the colleges they wanted to go to didn't require it. They just required, entrance level exam. And so they're like, why am I sitting for the GED? That's crazy. So they just entered college. And that was the right choice for them. But if they would have sat for the GED or if they wanted to sit for the ACT, they could have done that. That's not a problem. We could have gotten them some coaching for my younger son. Obviously his language issues would come into play with testing. We could have gotten him some coaching, or we could have made the decision that we made, that he would go to a design school, which couldn't care less about his ACT math score. He just had to show up with some talent, some passion, a few skills, and they would do the rest.
Okay. So it's almost like, because I'm thinking in the public school system, they have like this cookie cutter, and comparing kids, but having them at home just builds their confidence because you are focused on all of that.
Well, and think of it this way, when they're at home with you, you are offering them an opportunity to really get deep and explore who they are at a very personal level, because you as a parent educator are dealing with them one-to-one, and they don't see themselves as achievement as a social thing, other than sometimes you have to collaborate as a team to meet a goal. But their desire is going to be very individual to them naturally, because they're used to having that one-to-one coaching, having you as a teacher focus on them and explore and expand what they want to know and what they do know. So they're naturally going to seek out what is best for them. They really will. In the same way, when you handed them a reading assignment and they picked a book they loved, and that performance on that paper that they wrote about that book was stellar because they loved the book, help them find a career path they love, their performance will be stellar because they love that path. Yeah. So, and sometimes it doesn't take a GED, it doesn't take a diploma. Sometimes it doesn't even take college. So, for a lot of our students, that's becoming less and less necessary because of the level of self-directed learning you can do as an adult online. It's amazing. Back years ago when my boys were first doing online learning from home, Khan Academy was only just beginning. And now there are parents who use that exclusively, and there are college students who are making up for years of problematic public schooling by just taking a year off, going into Khan Academy, catching up, and then enrolling and doing stellar in their college experience. So there's no one path.
Okay. There's some comments and some question. Well, there's one question, some comments. So just a few of the comments, then I'll ask a question. So I think autism has always been commonplace, but it's just so happens that more people are seeking evaluations. And then when I was in public school, I was forced to focus on academic subjects rather than art classes, which made me upset because I wanted a career in visual art and still do. I'm now planning on going to art school for illustration and getting my master's degree in curriculum development. My goal is to develop secular homeschool illustration curriculum. And so then the question, that's an example of pursuing interest. So then the question is, have you tried AAC with your son?
AAC, no. No, we just did literacy-based unit studies. And then when he went to a school for dyslexia to get coaching there, that director uses Orton Gillingham. So he did get some Orton Gillingham in there for 2 years.
Okay.
But
I was wondering that too, the Orton Gillingham.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
I have not tried AAC. I've not tried AAC. What is that?
Yeah, I don't know what that is either.
So if you can comment again and let us know, because that's interesting though about the more commonplace versus more diagnoses. I agree, absolutely, we're getting better at diagnosing it. But the latest research that is just to die for fascinating has been in the area of nutrition. Just saying, as our food supply becomes more and more processed, these affects of autism, and I agree, it's one of those things, and when they test at the audiological level, they can tell you either have it or you don't. There are certain behaviors that are mimicked in other issues. Like, for example, there are lots of overlap in certain kinds of social issues between ADD kids on Ritalin and autistic kids. So you have some overlap in other diagnoses, but there probably is a threshold of people who are, because they have the audiological disorder that, as my son's audiologist put it, all children who are diagnosed autistic have this disorder, but not all children who have this audiological disorder are diagnosed autistic. So there are a lot of people out there struggling with sensory issues, and they're just managing, they're just dealing. And if they were thoroughly tested, they might pop up as somebody who who should have been diagnosed as autistic. So yeah, we are getting better at diagnosing these things, absolutely. But I would absolutely also say one of the issues that we're having in the increase is nutrition based, and the fact that our food supply has changed dramatically since the 60s and 70s. So I think it's both, right? Both are at work there. But I love the idea of, taking the passion in visual arts, turning that into curriculum that people could use. And I mean, that's hugely supportive of the autistic community, because when you're language delayed, your spatial awareness is off the charts. And therefore you can really be taught deep intellectual lessons visually, where maybe language doesn't apply yet. And I know with your daughter, you use sign language, and sign language is often used as a tool for autistics who are thoroughly language delayed. But that can be expanded, because there's a whole area of learning we don't often understand, because it's so easy to observe and test people when they have a communication behavior that's verbal. Not so easy to test communication behaviors that are nonverbal.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just harder to, because of the nuances of how we've been assimilated and in culture and families, so, and there's just not been as much testing in the nonverbal sphere, but visual, spatial understanding, and what we're starting to understand now about how the brain works, and when one area shuts down or is not as strong, it adapts in other areas. And we have potentially huge opportunity to help kids develop spatially, where maybe they're still struggling verbally, and then we can wait for the verbal to catch up, which also is language delay issue. Is sometimes it's just a delay. They're not ready yet. They're not ready to speak. They're not ready to read. It's not that they won't. And then of course it becomes a trial and error when they learn what therapies are they going to need, because if they're that delayed, they are probably going to need some assistance in speaking clearly and certain other aspects of language development. But yeah, that's great. A curriculum designed for that. Please. That's awesome.
So she did respond and say AAC actually stands for Alternative Augmented Communication. I'm going to have to look it up. I don't know what it is.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. My academic background is in communication and sociology. But because I've been in business for many years at this point, my fundamental research is really very outdated. So I'm going to want to go look into that and see what we can learn. So, yes.
Okay. Well, we're coming to the end of the interview. I just want to thank you so much, Lisa, for coming on and spending time with me. So for everyone else, at the end of this month, Peggy will actually be back, and we'll be hosting 3 more episodes with homeschool veterans who will be sharing more wisdom learned from the trenches of home education struggled learners. So until then, take care, God bless, and thank you for being part of the conversation. Thank you so much.
This is Empowering Homeschool Conversations, provided by SPED Homeschool. Go to spedhomeschool.com to get resources and support for teaching your unique learner at home.